Welcome to the final reading of the final chapter of The Call of the Wild by Jack London. We're now reading the second half of chapter 7. As the fall of the year came on, the moose appeared in greater abundance, moving slowly down to meet the winter in the lower and less rigorous valleys. Buck had already dragged down a stray, part-grown calf, but he wished strongly for longer and more formidable quarry, and he came upon it one day on the divide at the head of the creek. A band of 20 moose had crossed over from the land of streams and timber, and chief among them was a great bull. He was in a savage temper, and standing over 6 feet from the ground was a formidable an antagonist as ever Buck could desire. Back and forth the bull tossed his great antlers, benching to 14 points and embracing 7 feet within the tips. His small eyes burned with a vicious and bitter light, while he roared with fury at the sight of Buck. From the bull's side, just forward of the flank, protruded a feather arrow end, which accounted for his savageness. Guided by that instinct which came from the old hunting days of the premortal world, Buck proceeded to cut the bull out from the herd. It was no slight task. He would bark and dance about in front of the bull, just out of reach of the greatest antlers and of the terrible splay hoofs which could have stamped out his life with a single blow. Unable to turn his back on the famed danger and go on, the bull would be into paradigms of rage. At such moments he charged Buck, who retreated craftily, luring him on by simulated inability to escape. But when he was thus separated from his fellows, 2 or 3 of the younger bulls would charge back upon Buck and enable the wounded bull to rejoin the herd. There is patience of the wild, dogged, tireless, persistent as life itself, that holds motionless for endless hours the spider in its web, the snake in its coils, the panther in its ambuscade. This patience belongs particularly to life when it hunts its living food, and it belonged to Buck. As he clung to the flank of the herd, retarding its march, irritating the young bulls, worrying the cows with their half-grown calves, and driving the wounded bull mad with helpless rage. For half a day this continued. Buck multiplied himself, attacking from all sides, enveloping the herd in a whirlwind of menace, cutting out his victim as fast as it could rejoin its mates, wearing out the patience of the creatures betrayed upon, which is a lesser patience than that of creatures preying. As the day wore on along, and the sun dropped to its bed in the northwest, the darkness had come back, and the fall nights were 6 hours long. The young bulls retraced their steps more and more reluctantly to the aid of their bestest leader. The downcoming winter was hurrying them on to the lower levels, and it seemed that they could never shake off this tireless creature that had them back. Besides, it was not the life of the herd nor the young bulls that was threatened. The life of only one member was demanded, which was a remoter interest in their lives, and in the end they were content to pay the toll. As twilight fell on the old bull stood with lowered head, watching his mates, the cows he had known, the calves he had fathered, the bulls he had mastered, as they shambled on at rapid pace through the fading light. He could not follow, for before his nose leaped the merciless terror that would not let him go. 300 weight, more than half a ton he weighed. He had lived a long, strong life, full of fight and struggle, and at the end he faced death at the teeth of a creature whose head did not reach beyond his great knuckled knees. From then on, night and day, Buck never left his prey, never gave it a moment's rest, never permitted it to browse the leaves of trees or shoots of young birch and willow. Nor did he give the wounded bull opportunity to slake his burning thirst in the slender, trickling streams they crossed. Often in desperation, he burst into the stretches of fight. Such times Buck did not attempt to stay him, but looped easily at his heels, satisfied with the way the game was played, lying down when the moose stood still, attacking him fiercely when he strove to eat or drink. The great head drooped more and more under its tree of horns, and shambling trot grew weaker and weaker. He took to standing for long periods, with nose to the ground, and dejected ears dropped limply, and Buck found more time in which to get water for himself and in which to rest. At such moments, panting with red, lolling tongue, and with eyes fixed upon the big bull, it appeared to Buck that a change was coming over the face of things. He could feel a new stir in the land. As the moose was coming to the land, other kinds of life were coming in. Forest and stream and air seemed palpitant with their presence. The news of it was borne in upon him, not by sight or sound or smell, but by some other and subtler sense. He heard nothing, saw nothing, yet knew that the land was somehow different, that though its strange things were afoot and raging, and he resolved instigate after it had finished the business in hand. At last, at the end of the 4th day, he pulled the great moose down. For a day and a night he remained by the kill, eating and sleeping, turn and turn about. Then, rested, refreshed, and strong, he turned his face toward the camp and John Thornton. He broke into the long, easy lope and went on hour after hour, never at loss for the tangled way, heading straight home through strange country with certitude of direction that put man and his magnetic needle to shame. As he held on, he became more and more conscious of the new stir in the land. There was life abroad in it different from the life in which he had been there throughout the summer. No longer was it the fact borne in upon him in some subtle, mysterious way. The birds talked of it, the squirrels chattered about it, the very breeze whispered of it. Several times he stopped and drew the fish in the fresh morning air in great sniffs, reading a message which made him leap on with greater speed. He was oppressed with a sense of calamity happening, if it were not calamity already happened, and as he crossed from the last watershed and dropped down to the valley toward camp, he proceeded with greater caution. 3 miles away he came upon a fresh trail that sent his neck hair rippling and bristling. It led straight toward camp and John Thornton. Buck hurried on, swiftly and steadily, every nerve straining and tense, alert to the details in which told a story, all but the end. His nose gave him a varying description of the passage of life on the hills in which he was traveling. He remarked the pregnant silence of the forest. The bird life had flitted. The squirrels were in hiding. One only he saw, a sleek gray fellow, flattened against the gray dead limb, so he seemed a part of it, a woodiness upon the wood itself. As Buck slid along with the obscureness of the gliding shadow, his nose was jerked suddenly to the side, as through positive force had gripped and pulled it. He followed the new scent to a thicket and found Nig. He was lying on his side, dead where he had dragged himself, an arrow protruding, head and feathers from either side of his body. 100 yards farther on, Buck came up to one of the sled dogs Thornton had bought at Dawson. This dog was thrashing about in a death struggle directly on the trail, and Buck passed around him without stopping. From the camp came faint sound of many voices, wheezing and following in sing-song chant. Belling forward to the edge of the clearing, he found Hans lying on his face, feathered with arrows like a porcupine. At the same instant, Buck peered out where the sombre lodge had been and saw what had made his hair leap straight up on his neck and shoulders. A gust of overpowering rage swept over him. He did not know that he growled, but he growled aloud with a terrible fury. For the last time in his life, he allowed passion to usurp cunning and reason, and it was because of the great love for John Thornton that he lost his head. The yachts were dancing about the wreckage of the Spruce Bow Lodge, and they heard a fearful roaring and saw rushing upon them an animal like which they had never seen before. It was Buck, a live hurricane of fury, hurling himself upon them in a frenzy to destroy. He sprang upon the foremost man. It was the chief, ripping off the throat wide until the rent jugular had sprouted of blood. He did not pause to worry about the victim, but ripped in passing with the next bound, tearing wide throat of a second man. There was no withstanding him. He plunged about in their very midst, tearing, rending, destroying, a terrific motion in which defied the arrows they discharged at him. In fact, so inconceivably rapid were his movements, and so close were the Indians, tangled together, they shot at one another with arrows, and one young hunter, hurling a spear at Buck in midair, drove it through the chest of another hunter with such force that the point broke through the skin and back stood out beyond. Then a panic seized the yachts, and they fled in terror to the woods, proclaiming as they fled the advent of the evil spirit. And truly Buck was the friend incarnate, raging at their heels and dragging them down like deer as they raced through the trees. It was a fateful day for them. They scattered far and wide all over the country, and it was not until a week later the last of the survivors gathered together in a lower valley and counted their losses. As for Buck, wearing the pole suit, he returned to the desolated camp. He found Pete where he had been killed on the blankets in the first moment of surprise. Thornton's desperate struggle was fresh written on the earth, and Buck scented every detail of it down to the edge of a deep pool. By the edge, head and forest in the water, they skeet, faithful to the last. The pool itself, muddy and discolored from the sluice boxes, eventually hid what it contained, and it contained John Thornton. For Buck followed its trace into the water, from which no trace led away. All day Buck brooded by the pool or roamed restlessly above the camp. Death was a concession of moment, as a passing out and away from the lives of living. He knew John Thornton was dead. It left a great void in him, somewhat akin to the hunger, but a void which ached and ached, and which food could not fill. At times when he paused to contemplate the yachts, he forgot the pain of it, and at such times he was aware of a great pride in himself, a pride greater than any he had experienced. He had killed man, the noblest game of all, and he had killed in the face of law of club and fame. He sniffed the bodies curiously. They had died so easily. It was harder to kill a husky than them. They were no match at all. Were it not for their arrows and spears and clubs, thenceforward he would be unafraid of them, except when they bore in their hands and arrows, spears and clubs. Night came on, and a full moon rose high over the trees into the sky, lightening the land until it lay bathed in a ghostly day. And with the coming of the night, brooding and mourning at the pool, Buck became alive to a stirring of the new life in the forest other than that which the yachts had made. He stood up, listening and skimming. Far away drifted a faint sharp yelp, followed by a chorus of similar sharp yelps. As the moments passed, the yelps grew closer and closer. Again, Buck knew them to be things he heard in other world which persisted in his memory. He walked to the center of open space and listened. It was the call. Many noted call, sounding more luringly and compelling than ever before. And as never before, he was ready to obey. John Thornton was dead. The last tie was broke. Man and the claims of man no longer bound him. Hunting their living meat as the Yeats were hunting it, on flanks of the migrating moose, the wolf pack had last crossed over from the land of streams and timber, invaded Buck's Valley, into the clearing where the moonlight streamed. They poured in a silvery flood, and in the center of the clearing stood Buck, motionless as a statue, waiting their coming. They were awed. So still and large he stood, and a moment's pause fell until the boldest one leaped straight for him. Like a flash, Buck struck, breaking the neck. Then he stood without movement as before, the stricken wolf rolling in agony behind him. 3 others tried it in sharp succession, and one after the other. They drew back, streaming blood from slashed throats or shoulders. This was sufficient to fling the whole pack forward, pell-mell crowded together, blocked and confused by its eagerness to pull down the prey. Buck's marvelous quickness and agility stood him in good stead, pivoting on his hind legs and snapping and gnashing as he was everywhere at once, presenting a front which was apparently unbroken. So swiftly did he whirl and guard from side to side, but to prevent them from getting behind him, he was forced back down past the pool and into the creek bed till he brought up against a high gravel bank. He worked along to a right angle in the bank, which men had made in the course of mining, and in this angle he came to bay, protected on 3 sides, and with nothing to do but face the front. And so well did he face it, that in the end of a half an hour, the wolves drew back, discomfited. The tongues of all were out and lowing, the white fangs showing cruelly white in the moonlight. Some were lying down with heads raised and ears poked forward. Others stood on their feet, watching him. And still others were leaping water from the pool. One wolf, long and lean and gray, advanced cautiously, in a friendly manner, and Buck recognized the wild brother with whom he had run for a night and a day. He was whining softly, and as Buck whined, they touched noses. Then an old wolf, gaunt and battle-scarred, came forward. Buck wreathed his lips into the preliminary of a snarl, but sniffed noses with him, whereupon the old wolf sat down, pointed nose at the moon, and broke out in the long wolf howl. The other sat down and howled, and now the call came to Buck, unmistakable. He too sat down and howled. This over, he came out of his angle, and pack crowded around him, sniffing in half-friendly, half-savage manner. The leaders lifted the yelp of the pack and sprang away into the woods. The wolves swung behind, yelping in chorus, and Buck ran with them, side by side with a wild brother, yelping as he ran. And here may well end the story of Buck. The years were not many, and the Yeats noted the change in the breed of timber wolves, for some were seen with spotches of brown on head and muscle, and with a rift of white centered down the chest. But more remarkable than this, the Yeats tell of a ghost dog that runs at the head of the pack. They are afraid of this ghost dog, for he has a cunning greater than they, stealing from the camps in fierce winters, robbing their traps, slaying their dogs, and defying their bravest hunters. Nay, the tale grows worse. Hunters there are who fail to return to the camp, and hunters there have been whom their tribesmen found with throats slashed cruelly open, with wolf prints about them, in the snow greater than the prints of any wolf. Each fall, when the Yeats follow the movement of the moose, there is a certain valley which they never enter, and women there who become sad when the world goes over the fire of how evil spirit came to select that valley for abiding place. In the summers, there is one visitor, however, to the valley of which the Yeats do not know. It is a great, gloriously coated wolf, and yet unlike any other wolves, he crosses alone from the smiling timberland and comes down to an open space among the trees. Here, a yellow stream flows from rotted moose hide, sacks and sinks into the ground, with long grasses growing through and vegetable mold, overturning it and hiding its yellow from the sun. And here he muses for a time, howling once, long and mournfully, ere he departs. But he is not always alone. When the long winter nights come on and the wolves follow their meat to the lower valleys, he may be seen running at the head of the pack through the pale moonlight, or glimmering gigantic above his fellows, his great throat a bellow as he sings a song of the younger world, which is the song of the pack. And that's the end of the story, The Call of the Wild by Jack London. Today's question is something that is found throughout the whole story. In The Call of the Wild, why does Jack London use dramatic visualization to depict Buck's visions? In The Call of the Wild, how does Jack London use dramatic visualization to depict Buck's visions? Thanks. I hope you enjoyed this story.